it's there for all to see. Oh, you placed the stars in the heavens, now you shine on me.
In the beginning, God in His wisdom and power created the heavens and the earth and all that it contains. He also established the laws to govern His diverse creation so that it would flourish in all of its ways. He created the light, air, moisture, organic matter, soil microbes, insects, earthworms, fauna and flora. He intentionally positioned each of them into their respective ecosystems and created the complex interrelationships that they would have with one another. The beginning was not an accidental big bang, nor did all things evolve from an amoeba, and you were certainly not a byproduct of an ape. It is in awe and wonder that we acknowledge the God of the Bible, the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as the creator of it all. The laws that He established in the very beginning are the same laws which continue to allow His creation to flourish today. God's ways are the ancient paths which have been established from before time began, and what we need to do is exercise humility, acknowledge that our ways are not working, and come and learn from the master farmer. However, since the fall of man, people have continued to lean on their own pathetic understanding, and all of creation suffers as a result of that. Jeremiah 6 verse 16 says, "Thus says the Lord, stand by the way and see and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls." But they said, "We will not walk in it." We need full persuasion to trust in the Ancient of Days, the one who established the ancient paths from the very beginning, and walk in these ancient paths to be able to inherit the fullness of His promises. Let's start by defining some of the fundamental differences between the practice of conventional farming versus farming God's way. Conventional farming. Typical practices of conventional farming include deep plowing, bare naked soils, monocropping, and the broadcasting of inputs. Conventional farming practices are the exact opposite of what we see God in His creation doing. Typically, they involve deep plowing and soil inversion, where the bottom layer of soil is brought to the top and the top is taken to the bottom. Also, the burning of crop residues or the incorporation through plowing them in. Growing the same crops year after year after year, and the broadcasting of inputs. Farming God's way. Isaiah chapter 55 verse 8 and 9. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Physically, the laws that God has put in place to manage His diverse creation include little or no soil disturbance, a thick blanket cover on the surface of the ground, a great biodiversity of species where plants have been designed by God to feed from the top, each with their own distinctive canopy cover. God is always constant also, He never changes His ways. In farming God's way practices, we are simply trying to follow what we see the Creator do as closely as possible in a manageable agricultural way. The 6 technology keys are no plowing, 100% cover with God's blanket that is 2.5 centimeters thick, practicing biodiversity, feeding plants from the top, ensuring canopy cover, and permanence. No plowing. Plowing is an age-old tradition rooted in the myth that you have to plow in order to plant. The concept of no plowing usually invokes a very negative reaction by farmers and gardeners, as it is in direct contrast to what they have been doing for generations. Don't think that plowing is only referring to that being done under power by tractors or animals. Plowing by hand using a hose over time will cause nearly as much damage, even though it is done to a shallower depth. It is still inverting the soil and breaking the soil structure. It is actually quite interesting to look at the history of when plowing started and how it has evolved over time. Plowing was done with hand tools like hoes for many centuries before Christ, but the sizes of cultivated lands were quite limited. Once farmers shifted to using animal draft power, they were able to expand their cultivated land areas significantly. Plows drawn by animals were made up of single tine tips made of steel, which penetrated through the heavy wooden beam and were mostly pulled by oxen or horses, with the plowman steering from behind. This type of plowing caused a very simple vertical cut of the soil with minimal soil inversion. The Bible makes inference to these kinds of simple tine plows. Joel chapter 3 verse 9 and 10 says, "Prepare for war, rouse the mighty men, let all the men of war advance and attack. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong." At wartime, they would break down their wooden plows and use the single steel tine tips to make swords. They were straight steel shafts, which would only scarify the soil, but most certainly would not invert it. In times of peace, the scripture says, they would reverse the process, beating their swords into plowshares once again. So between the times of war and peace, swords and plowshares were completely interchangeable. Micah chapter 4 verse 3 says, "Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war." There were many different types of plows in Bible times, each designed to suit different purposes. Another popular one was a triangular framed wooden harrow, which was typical for preparing soil for planting wheat. This was made from a wide, heavy wooden frame and had either hard wooden pegs pressed into it or arrow-type tines. These would cause minimal soil disturbance, and though they caused damage to the soil structure, they definitely did not invert the soil. It is likely that Elisha's plow, which he used to make a fire to sacrifice his oxen, was made from one like this. The scriptures give many accounts of the practice of plowing. So why do we advocate no plowing? Even Jesus used the analogy of plowing in his teaching. In Luke chapter 9 verse 62, he said, "No man, having put his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God." In Bible times, plowing was done with very light and short tines, which did not invert the soil. Instead, they just loosened it to a very shallow depth for planting. Moldboard plows were only developed in the 18th century to lift and throw the soil over, using hard wooden timber like hickory, which was then burnt to harden it further. Cast iron tips were later attached to the front of those moldboard plows to make them stronger, but they were still prone to breaking regularly. In 1837, Mr. John Deere designed the first steel blade from an old steel saw blade and put a tine on its front end, which revolutionized the moldboard plow forever. They were very strong, and the sharp edge prevented soil from clogging the blades. The John Deere business was really established on this innovation. In 1900, the disc plow was developed, which also became very popular. These plows were still being pulled by animal draft power, and it was only in the 1930s that tractors were first developed and made available to farmers. They allowed for multiple plow blades to be pulled and significantly increased the size of land areas that farmers could manage. It is interesting to note that it is only through the fairly recent development of the moldboard plow and then the disc plow that significant soil inversion was introduced into agriculture. And as tractors became more and more powerful, plowing went deeper and deeper with larger tracts of land under cultivation. Plowing, or inverting the soil as done in modern times, has proven to be very destructive, uneconomical, and environmentally degrading. The very first plowing tragedy occurred in the American Great Plains in the 1930s, after some devastating effects of plowing caused what is referred to as the Dust Bowl. These farmers had decided to practice very intensive harrowing of the top layers of the fields with the intention of creating a powder top mulch for the protection of moisture in the dry season, but they had not taken into account the enormity of the wind erosion that was still to come. The soil was picked up and dumped all over America, with some towns having houses and roads and vehicles buried under soil. Hundreds of thousands of farming families were forced to move from the Great Plains due to the economic collapse of the entire region. Between 1954 and 1960, a second devastating dust bowl, larger than the great wheatlands of Canada and Australia combined, developed through plowing marginal grasslands in Russia. In January 2005, a dust storm in Central Africa was recorded stretching over 5,300 kilometers and could be seen on satellite imagery. These dramatic examples of wind erosion were highly visible, but it should be emphasized that the malpractice of plowing also causes water erosion, which is far more devastating, with our soils ending up in the rivers, the catchments, and the oceans. Ethiopian farmers regard themselves as Africa's champion plowmen, with the philosophy of the more times you plow, the better your agricultural status, with some farmers plowing up to 5 times before planting small grains like teff and wheat. This picture shows the consequences of the pride of men and the destructiveness of his ways. The dark soil on the right-hand side shows the original soil level of this once level tract of land. Can you even imagine that whole area was once a productive farm field? Southern African countries' agricultural lands lose between 55 to 250 tons or 1,000 bags of soil per hectare per year through erosion. Estimates of the annual soil erosion in South Africa alone suggest losses of up to 500 million tons per year, which would fill a goods train 120,000 kilometers long and be able to circumnavigate the Earth 3 times at the equator. The worst part of it is we simply don't care. In 1943, Edward Faulkner wrote a book called Plowman's Folly. It was the first published work of no plowing, after he conducted many years of research on the destruction of the soils caused by plowing. It is good to be able to report that since these early pioneers experimented with these concepts, that worldwide agriculture is moving away from the plow, with over 205 million hectares currently being farmed with no plowing. No-till has caught on so much in South America that more than 68% of their land area in Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay is farmed without plowing. The rapid uptake by the South American farmers is attributed to the marked improvements in farm profitability. More than 66 million hectares are currently farmed without plowing in North America, which is regarded as the world leader in the agricultural sector, and the number of adopting farmers is increasing all the time. A wonderful farming family called the Lambs in Indiana haven't plowed their farm for 37 years, farming 5,500 hectares each year. When Bob Lamb was asked why he chose to stop plowing all those years ago, his response was simple: Grant, it was simply common sense. In 2006, the president of the FAO, which is the United Nations agricultural arm, endorsed no-till as the preferred method of cultivation. Unfortunately, very few African farmers have adopted these advancements, with only around 2 million hectares farmed without plowing in Africa of the 205 million hectares worldwide. 100% cover with God's blanket, that's 2.5 centimeters thick. Conventional farming is typically done with no soil cover whatsoever, and this is what we refer to as having naked soils. While there are some positive new technology shifts in the agricultural sector, there are only a few of them that establish a clear soil cover standard and none that advocates a thickness standard. God's creation is in direct contrast to man's ways, where there is no naked soil in productive ecosystems. For example, under a forest canopy, there is a thick cover on the soil surface made up of leaves and branches and decaying grasses and manure. We refer to this heavy mulch cover as God's blanket. In farming God's way, this standard is established at 100% cover, that is 2.5 centimeters thick. John chapter 3 verse 16 says, "For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, so that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life." Although Jesus was sent to save the world, most people rejected him and still continue to reject him today. He is the way, the truth, and the life, but only to those who receive him and believe in his name. Accepting Jesus' love doesn't fix everything straight away. It starts the journey of sanctification and the healing of our hearts. And as we are faithful to walk with him, his love creates the perfect environment for his work to be completed in us. In creation, God's blanket is just like the love of God, as it creates the perfect environment for living, healthy soils and for plants to flourish. In our fields, God's blanket has the potential to reveal God's promised abundance. But most farmers, without this knowledge, reject this amazing gift by burning, grazing, or burying it through plowing. To those that appreciate it, God's blanket becomes a real blessing and provides the ideal environment for the healing of the land to take place. Practice biodiversity. Biodiversity is the term used to describe the variety of animals and plants in an ecosystem. In God's creation, there is an incredible diversity of species. The Amazon rainforest, for example, has an estimated 80,000 plant species, over 1,000 species of birds, 350 species of reptiles, 311 species of mammals, just to name some of the larger species. It is impossible to emulate such a high animal, insect, and plant biodiversity in an agricultural system. However, in farming God's way, we heartily encourage on-farm plant biodiversity through 4 main planting practices: rotations, rotations within rotations, relay cropping, and cover cropping. All of these are covered in detail in the section Biodiversity through Alternative Crops. Biodiversity of living soil organisms, birds, and animal life is significantly enhanced through not plowing, 100% cover with God's blanket, using organic inputs, organic pest management, and an overall love and appreciation for God's creation. Feeding plants from the top. One of the most beautiful spectacles of creation are mature rainforests, which are some of the most productive ecosystems in the whole world, and they support an enormous biodiversity of plant and animal life. The most eye-catching are, of course, the giant trees that dominate the canopy and create the platforms for all the biotic life forms to thrive. Logically, one would think that these giant trees would have incredibly deep root systems, but it's not like that at all. Instead, they have feeder roots that are very shallow, even growing right into the blanket, and have been recorded to extend up to 100 meters wide. This clearly shows us that God designed for plants to feed from the top. They're not wasting energy or resources on scavenging nutrients that are deep down inside the soil profile. They know exactly where their food source comes from. So, what are these giants of the forest feeding on? God created all things, visible and invisible. And it is the vast numbers of the invisible organisms which are continually breaking down God's blanket, which is on top of the ground, and gradually releasing these nutrients into the top layer of the soil profile. Most of the decomposition is done by the invisible bacteria and fungi. Bacteria make up over 80% of the soil biota, And soil scientists estimate that a single teaspoon of mature forest soil can have over 1 billion bacteria in it, and up to 20,000 different species of bacteria. Fungi make up most of the balances of the soil organisms, with records of over 1 kilometer of fungal strands found in just 1 teaspoon of forest soil. It really does sound impossible, doesn't it? But that's what our Creator God is capable of doing. He's the God of the seen and the unseen, the God of the impossible, and He's the one who holds all things together. The soil microbes first convert the blanket into compost and eventually into readily available plant nutrients. These nutrients are bound in long carbon chains which slowly move into the top layers of the soil through insect and earthworm activity and leaching. In pristine soils like this organic matter is responsible for the dark coloration of the top layer and is the most fertile inside the soil profile. Plant roots have been designed by God to capitalize on this process of being fed from the top, extracting these nutrients from the dark, rich organic matter layer through their shallow root system. These nutrients are then used for new growth of fruits and leaves and twigs, which will in turn, over time, fall down to the ground surface, where they'll once again be recycled. In God's creation, there's no wastage of nutrients whatsoever, as it is in a continual closed cycle without any extraction. There's a common misconception of conventional farmers that you need to plow the blanket into the soil, as well as mix all the ingredients into the deep part of the soil profile to make them available to the plant roots. In Farming God's Way, we try to emulate what God has shown to us by allowing the blanket to gradually decompose on the soil surface, placing nutrients right near the plant's roots without mixing it in, using high quality Farming God's Way compost as our preferred input type. By far the most beneficial technique is to use Farming God's Way surface composting techniques, placing the compost in bands on the permanent planting lines with varying widths and thicknesses based on the crop type. Surface composting can be done with all crop types. However, because it requires substantial volumes of compost, we especially advocate this technique with higher value crops. See the vegetable guide for more information on surface composting. Ensure canopy cover. Another key feature we can learn from creation is how God designed for plants to have a dense canopy of leaves and branches formed by plants in close proximity to each other. In a mature rainforest, the canopy is usually around 30 to 40 meters high. However, there are actually multiple layers of stories, including the overstory, canopy, understory, shrub layer, and ground cover. These canopies have many benefits for the plants that dominate each story, as they capture sunlight and dominate the utilization of water, nutrients, and space. Competition between the dominant plants in the canopy stimulates their productivity, but at the same time, they dominate and outcompete the plants underneath them by casting shade and limiting their growth. There are also complex climatic benefits to the plants within a canopy story, including increased humidity, lower soil temperatures, increased carbon dioxide levels. We use the principles of canopy cover to shade out weeds, encourage competition between plants of the planted crop, create an optimal inter-canopy climate for crop growth. The way that we achieve canopy cover is by adjusting the plant population densities. Larger plants get planted in wide rows and in-row spacing, but as plants get smaller, their row spacing reduces along with the in-row spacing. Very large plants, including maize, sunflower, squashes, tomatoes, and eggplants, are planted at low population densities in single rows with wide in-rows. To prepare plantings for these plants, you need to use high-quality measuring ropes to ensure you attain the correct population density. Medium-sized plants such as sorghum, millet, groundnuts, beans, peas, and soybeans are planted at higher population densities, still with single rows, but with narrow in-row spacings. Smaller plants such as wheat, rye, oats, beetroot, carrots and turnips are planted at very high plant population densities with double or triple rows and narrow in-row spacings. In order to get homogeneous canopy cover, it is very important to do the basics right, such as having level fields, well-drained soils, no compaction, the correct amounts of inputs, and sowing to high standards. However, it is just as important to maintain good canopy cover in your fields through gapping, thinning, top dressing, weed control, and good pest management. Permanence. It is vitally important to go through the process described in biblical key number 6, staking your claim, which is all about taking spiritual authority over the land that God has given to you through prayer and dedication. However, it is just as important to go through the process of staking your claim physically to establish permanence in your fields. Isaiah chapter 28 verse 10 says, "For he says, order on order, order on order, line upon line, line upon line, a little here, a little there." Proverbs 4 verse 11 through 12 says, "I will instruct you in the way of wisdom and lead you along straight paths. When you walk, you won't be held back, and when you run, you won't stumble." Permanence brings order into our fields and allows us to build effectively and efficiently, line upon line. Permanence is established by using both measuring ropes and permanent pegs, ideally at 75 centimeter intervals. Permanence ensures that planting is done accurately at the same planting line or band every season. In fields where we would typically grow field crops like maize, sorghum, soybeans, groundnuts, etc., we encourage farmers to place permanent pegs preferably after every 10 rows of 75 centimeters. Vegetables, on the other hand, are much more intensively farmed with frequent rotations and rotations within rotations, and so permanence is established after every 75 centimeter row line. The benefits of permanence include improved soil fertility in the planting area. Leftover nutrients are available to the following crops. Improved soil structure in the planting area. Decomposing root channels allow for greatly improved aeration and permeability. Soil pH is improved all the time in the planting area. Compaction is only ever taking place in the walkways. Soil disturbance is minimal, resulting in greatly reduced weed incidence. Ultimately, permanence will improve your crops and your profitability. The importance of permanence cannot be stressed enough, and yet this is one key part of farming God's way that seems to be poorly implemented by farmers. Imagine building a house without a foundation. You would never do that. Well, the same applies and is true with farming. We need a good, solid, permanent foundation to be able to work from so that we can build into a prosperous future. Wherever farming God's way is implemented wholeheartedly, we see incredible results. And this is one of those high standards principles, which is an essential part of the equation. Straight lines in farming God's way fields look fantastic, but they are not like that for looks. Instead, they are in straight lines because we want to achieve permanence. This is very important to understand and to implement right from the very start, and then you will have permanence forever in your fields. Wherever a garden is planted nyorga or in crooked paths, that is not done to high standards, and you don't get any of the benefits of permanence. If your curved rope causes permanence to be missed by as little as 10 centimeters, the plants won't be able to benefit from the leftover nutrients or improved soil pH or fertility or organic matter, and this will affect your ability to be able to have sustainable profits. So be diligent and follow the step-by-step procedure carefully from the beginning. The 6 technology keys are no plowing, 100% cover with God's blanket that is 2.5 centimeters thick. Practicing biodiversity, feeding plants from the top, ensuring canopy cover and permanence. God's ways are the ancient paths that God has established since the very beginning. Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5 and 6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all of your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all of your ways acknowledge Him and He will make your paths straight." Do you trust in Him enough to change your ways? Do you have the humility to be able to stop leaning on your own understanding? Are you willing to acknowledge and follow Him in all of your ways? If so, He will make your paths straight.
Promises, you've got to walk in it, yeah. Shine bright, let your glory